the first time anyone from the HOA knocked on my door. They weren't asking questions, they weren't introducing themselves, and they sure weren't interested in hearing why I had built the concrete wall running along the edge of my property. They came with a violation notice already printed, already signed, already convinced I was the problem. Looking back now, standing on my porch months later while listening to those same people argue over insurance adjusters, lawsuits, and repair estimates, I realized something that 18 years working as a county drainage engineer had taught me long before retirement. Water doesn't care about opinions, popularity, or neighborhood politics. It only follows gravity. My name is Ethan Caldwell. I'm 46 years old, and before I retired from Mecklenburg County Infrastructure Services, I spent nearly 2 decades designing stormwater systems, inspecting flood channels, and explaining to impatient developers why Mother Nature always collected her debt eventually. My wife, Melissa, used to joke that I couldn't drive across a bridge without critiquing the drainage underneath it. And honestly, she wasn't wrong. Once you spend enough years watching neighborhoods flood because somebody wanted prettier landscaping instead of proper engineering, you stop looking at hills and creeks the same way everyone else does. You start seeing runoff paths, soil saturation, culvert capacity, and elevation changes. Even when everyone else just sees nice grass and expensive houses. That's exactly why, when we bought our place outside Ashford Ridge, North Carolina, I fell in love with it immediately. The house wasn't fancy. White vinyl siding, a detached workshop, gravel driveway, old oak trees that dropped enough leaves every fall to keep me busy for weeks, but it sat almost 14 feet higher than the upscale subdivision built downhill. Every realtor I talked to focused on how outdated my house looked compared to the million-dollar brick homes below. I barely listened because all I could think was, whoever approved that subdivision ignored half the watershed report. The developers had carved beautiful streets into what used to be a natural floodplain, relying on oversized retention ponds that looked impressive on brochures but were barely adequate during a normal storm, let alone the hurricanes that occasionally rolled through western North Carolina. I knew it because I had reviewed projects almost identical to it years earlier. I wasn't predicting disaster. I simply recognized bad engineering wrapped in attractive landscaping. During my first year there, I invested nearly $80,000 of my retirement savings into something none of my neighbors understood. Along the lower edge of my property, I built a reinforced concrete flood berm tied into natural rock beneath the soil, with buried drainage pipes directing overflow toward an old wooded runoff channel that had existed long before the subdivision was ever built. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't decorative. It looked exactly like what it was. Infrastructure. My nearest neighbor, an older farmer named Hank, stopped by one afternoon while I was checking the forms before the concrete pour. He leaned against his truck, spit into the dirt, and asked, "Planning for the end of the world?" I laughed and said, "No, just planning for the day people forget how water works." He chuckled, tipped his cap, and drove away. That conversation stayed with me because Hank was one of the few people who understood that practical solutions rarely win beauty contests. Unfortunately, everyone living inside Ashford Ridge Estates thought differently. Their HOA president, Denise Harper, cared about appearances with a level of dedication that almost deserved respect if it hadn't been so exhausting. Every mailbox matched. Every flower bed followed the approved color palette. Even garbage cans had to disappear before sunset or you'd receive a warning letter. I wasn't technically a member of their HOA because my property predated the subdivision by decades, but my driveway connected to the same county road, which apparently was enough for Denise to decide my home reflected on her community. The first time she visited, she smiled politely while staring past me at the concrete berm like someone looking at an abandoned factory. "Mr. Papal-Laden, Caldwell," she said sweetly. "Have you considered adding decorative stone to soften the appearance?" I smiled back. "Have you considered reading a topographical map?" Her smile disappeared so quickly it almost made me feel guilty. Almost. Over the following months, I noticed more board members slowing down outside my property, taking pictures from their SUVs, whispering during evening walks whenever they passed my fence. Melissa kept telling me to ignore it. "They're bored," she'd say while pouring coffee. "People invent problems when life gets too comfortable." Maybe she was right, but something about the attention bothered me because engineers develop instincts the same way firefighters do. You notice patterns before everyone else. Then one Tuesday morning, I opened my mailbox and found a cream-colored envelope stamped with the Ashford Ridge Community Association seal. Inside sat a laminated violation notice accusing me of constructing an unsightly, unauthorized structure that redirected natural water flow and negatively impacted neighborhood aesthetics. There was even a weekly fine attached, $1,000 every 7 days until the structure was removed. Tucked behind the notice were meeting minutes where one board member actually laughed that my ugly bunker wall probably wouldn't survive the next hurricane anyway. I didn't get angry. Not yet. I carried the papers into my workshop, spread them across my drafting table beside 30 years of survey maps and drainage studies, then slowly opened the original watershed analysis I'd kept since before buying the property. As I traced the contour lines with my finger, I couldn't help smiling because the board had spent months arguing about how the wall looked without ever asking the one question that actually mattered. What exactly was that wall protecting? They thought it only kept my yard dry. They never realized it had been quietly protecting theirs every single time it rained. I wish I could tell you I marched straight down to the HOA clubhouse, slammed the violation notice on Denise Harper's desk, and gave everyone a speech they'd never forget. But that's not what happened. Experience teaches you that the louder someone is, the less they're usually listening. So instead I made another pot of coffee, spread every survey map I owned across my workbench, and started checking numbers I already knew by heart, because if 18 years in public infrastructure taught me anything, it was that facts don't become less true just because a committee votes against them. My berm wasn't simply stopping water from reaching my workshop. It intercepted runoff from nearly 37 acres of sloping woodland above my property, slowing peak flow before redirecting it through an abandoned natural drainage corridor that eventually emptied into a protected creek. During heavy storms, nearly 40% of the runoff that would otherwise barrel downhill toward Ashford Ridge Estates was being absorbed, delayed, or safely redirected. I hadn't built the berm to save the neighborhood. Honestly, when I poured the first load of concrete, I was thinking about my own investment, my own home, my own retirement. The fact that everyone downhill benefited was simply how hydrology worked. Water doesn't ask permission before helping somebody. It just follows the easiest path. I called my old coworker, Martin Doyle, a hydraulic engineer who still worked for the county. "Tell me I'm crazy," I said. He laughed before I even finished explaining. "You're not crazy," he replied. "You're dealing with people who think landscaping is engineering." We spent nearly an hour reviewing rainfall projections, soil saturation data, and historical flood records. Before hanging up, he paused for a second and quietly said, "You know, if they force you to remove that berm before hurricane season, somebody's going to have a very bad week." Those words stayed with me, not because they frightened me, but because I realized there was still time to prevent it. The following morning, I mailed Denise and every HOA board member a certified package. Inside was a professionally organized engineering summary, simplified enough that anyone without technical training could understand it. I included elevation diagrams, flood modeling, aerial photographs, and a one-page explanation showing exactly where stormwater would travel if the berm disappeared. I even highlighted the section predicting increased flow into the subdivision during extreme rainfall. At the very end, I attached a liability acknowledgement stating that if they continued demanding removal after reviewing the engineering evidence, they accepted responsibility for any resulting consequences caused by the elimination of a lawful structure on private property. I wasn't threatening anyone. I wasn't asking for money. I simply wanted something in writing proving they had been warned. 3 days later, Denise called. Her voice sounded different, not friendly exactly, but noticeably less confident. "Mr. Caldwell, the board thinks your report is exaggerated." "Which part?" I asked. She hesitated. "Well, all of it." "Did anyone hire an engineer to review it?" Silence. "No." "Then what exactly are you comparing it to?" Another pause. Finally, she sighed. "Our landscaping consultant says your wall looks unnecessary." I actually laughed. I couldn't help it. "Denise," I said, "that's like asking your dentist to inspect an airplane engine." She didn't appreciate that comparison. That evening, the board held another meeting. I wasn't invited, but one homeowner I knew slightly, a retired school principal named Evelyn Brooks, quietly emailed me afterward. She had attended because her husband served on the architectural committee. According to her, several residents had become uncomfortable after reading my report. One younger board member even suggested postponing enforcement until an independent engineer could inspect the site. Denise shut the idea down almost immediately. She argued that backing down would make the HOA appear weak and encourage future challenges from other property owners. It wasn't about drainage anymore. It had become a contest of authority. Once pride enters a room, Common sense usually finds the nearest exit. 2 days later, another envelope arrived. This one wasn't a warning. It was their attorney's formal demand ordering removal within 10 business days or face legal action seeking mandatory compliance. Melissa read the letter twice before looking at me across the kitchen table. "What are you going to do?" she asked. I stared out the window toward the berm stretching quietly along the tree line. Exactly what they asked. She raised an eyebrow. "You're actually going to tear it down?" I nodded. "If someone insists on making an informed decision after being warned, eventually you have to respect that choice." She knew me well enough to recognize that tone. I wasn't being sarcastic. I had already made up my mind. The next morning, a bright yellow Caterpillar excavator rolled onto my driveway. It belonged to a contractor I'd worked with years earlier, named Luis Herrera, one of the best excavation foremen I'd ever met. He climbed down, looked at the berm, then looked back at me. "Please tell me you're building something bigger." "No," I answered quietly. "I'm removing it." His face tightened. "You've lost your mind?" "I hope not." I handed him copies of the engineering report and the HOA attorney's demand letter. 10 minutes later, he handed them back. "I'd refuse the job if it wasn't your property." "I know. You realize what's coming." I looked toward the subdivision below. Kids were riding bicycles. A couple walked their dog past the community pond. Sprinklers clicked rhythmically across perfect green lawns. It looked peaceful. Almost too peaceful. "Yeah," I said softly. "That's why I tried so hard to stop this." Demolition began that afternoon. The first section came apart slowly, reinforced concrete breaking under the excavator's hydraulic hammer with dull echoes rolling across the valley. Several neighbors gathered near the entrance to the subdivision, recording everything with their phones. A few smiled. One man actually clapped when the first large section collapsed into broken chunks. Denise arrived in a white SUV about an hour later. She stepped out wearing sunglasses despite the cloudy sky and folded her arms. "Glad you finally came to your senses," she called across the property line. I shut off the excavator long enough to answer. "No, Denise. I'm simply honoring your decision." She smirked. "Looks like we won after all." I remember looking past her toward the western horizon where dark gray clouds were already beginning to stack above the Blue Ridge Mountains. Weather forecasts had been changing all week. What was expected to be a tropical depression offshore had strengthened unexpectedly, and County Emergency Management had just issued updated rainfall projections. I checked my phone again. 8 to 10 inches of rain possible within 24 hours. Martin texted me only 4 words. "Hope they listened." I typed back just 2. They didn't. By sunset, nearly 60 feet of the berm had been removed, leaving an open channel where stormwater had naturally flowed centuries before the subdivision existed. Luis parked the excavator, climbed into his truck, then rolled down his window before leaving. "Ethan," he said quietly, "I've been doing excavation 30 years. I've never driven away from a job hoping the weather forecast is wrong." I watched his taillights disappear around the bend, then stood alone beside the unfinished gap until the first cold raindrop landed on the back of my hand. I looked downhill one last time, watching porch lights flicker on across Ashford Ridge while thunder rumbled somewhere beyond the hills. And for the first time since this whole mess began, I wasn't wondering whether I had made the right decision. I was wondering whether any of them had. The rain started just after midnight, not with the dramatic lightning and sideways wind you see on television, but with that slow, steady rhythm that almost lulls you into believing the forecast had been exaggerated. Then around 2 in the morning, it changed. The drops became sheets. The wind picked up hard enough to make the old oak trees behind my workshop groan, and by 3 I could hear something I hadn't heard in years. The runoff channel was alive. I pulled on my rain jacket, grabbed a flashlight, and stepped onto the porch. Even in the darkness, I could tell exactly what was happening. The gap where my berm had stood was now carrying thousands of gallons of water every minute, moving exactly where gravity had always intended it to move before developers reshaped the hillside. There wasn't a single surprise in front of me. Every contour, every stream of muddy water, every overflowing ditch matched the engineering models I'd mailed to the HOA almost 2 weeks earlier. The only difference was that diagrams don't scream, and floodwater does. Just before sunrise, my phone started vibrating nonstop. Emergency weather alerts, county road closures, messages from Martin asking if I was okay, then one call after another from numbers I didn't recognize. I ignored every single one until Melissa quietly walked into the kitchen holding her own phone. "Ethan," she whispered, "turn on the local news." The helicopter footage looked surreal. Ashford Ridge Estates had become a collection of brown ponds, separated by rooftops and driveways barely visible beneath the water. Basement windows disappeared completely. Garage doors buckled inward. Expensive patio furniture floated through cul-de-sacs like children's toys. Later investigators estimated nearly 18 homes had taken on significant floodwater, with several foundations developing structural movement after saturated soil shifted beneath them. Families stood outside wrapped in blankets while firefighters helped carry photo albums, pets, and whatever valuables they could salvage. I didn't celebrate. I couldn't. Watching people lose pieces of their lives isn't satisfying, even when you warned them it was coming. Around 8 that morning, Denise called again. I answered this time. There was no confidence left in her voice, no rehearsed authority, no carefully chosen legal language. She sounded exhausted. Ethan, we need to talk. I stayed quiet. You were right, she finally said. Those 3 words hung between us for several seconds before she continued. The insurance companies are already saying flood damage isn't covered under most of the policies. People are panicking. Contractors are booked for weeks. We've got elderly residents who can't stay in their homes. I closed my eyes because this wasn't the conversation I'd ever wanted to have. Being correct never feels nearly as rewarding as people imagine when someone else is paying the price. I'm sorry people are suffering, I answered honestly, but I warned the board more than once. Denise didn't argue. She couldn't. Every warning, every certified letter, every engineering report was already sitting in a file somewhere with signatures proving they had received them. By that afternoon, dozens of homeowners packed the HOA clubhouse demanding answers. Evelyn later told me the meeting dissolved into shouting within minutes. Some blamed Denise. Others blamed the attorney who insisted on enforcement. A few finally admitted they had never even read the report before voting. One resident stood up and asked the question nobody wanted to hear. If Mr. Caldwell hadn't removed that berm, would our homes have flooded? Silence filled the room before another board member quietly answered, probably not. That single sentence ended Denise's presidency long before any official resignation. 2 days later, she drove to my house alone. No sunglasses, no expensive blazer, no clipboard. She looked like someone who hadn't slept since the storm arrived. We sat on my porch while looking downhill at crews pumping water from basements. The homeowners want the protection rebuilt, she said softly. Not the board. The families. I nodded. It can be rebuilt. What do you need? She asked. I handed her a folder I prepared the night before. Inside was a proposal covering reconstruction costs, long-term maintenance, and one non-negotiable condition. Any future changes affecting drainage around the subdivision would require independent engineering review before the HOA could vote on them. No more decisions based on appearances. No more landscaping opinions replacing science. Denise flipped through the pages, then looked at me. That's all? I smiled a little. I don't need revenge. I just don't want another family standing ankle-deep in their living room because someone confused confidence with competence. The homeowners approved the agreement within 72 hours. Construction began the following week, this time with several residents stopping by to ask questions instead of taking pictures. Kids watched from bicycles while Louise poured the new reinforced structure, stronger than the original and tied into additional drainage improvements the neighborhood should have built years earlier. The next major storm arrived that fall. It wasn't quite as powerful, but it brought enough rain to test every improvement we'd made. Melissa and I stood on the porch drinking coffee while water rushed safely through the system exactly as designed. Downhill, not a single basement flooded. A few months later, I found something that still makes me smile every time I think about it. My mailbox held an envelope from the HOA. Inside wasn't another violation notice. It was a handwritten thank you card signed by dozens of homeowners, including several people who had once complained the berm ruined their view. Denise's signature was there too, followed by one simple sentence. We should have listened before we voted. I still keep that card inside the same drawer as the original violation notice because together they remind me of something bigger than one neighborhood dispute. Expertise isn't arrogance when it's backed by experience. And sometimes the most dangerous words any community can say are, "It looks unnecessary." Now I'm curious what you think. If you had been in my position, would you have fought the HOA in court to keep the berm standing? Or would you have done exactly what they demanded after warning them about the consequences? Let me know in the comments, because stories like this are never just about flood walls. They're about pride, responsibility, and what happens when people stop listening to the people who actually know what they're talking about. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share it with someone who believes common sense should always matter more than appearances.